Alright everyone, welcome to the first installment in the plugin Teardown series where I will be dissecting existing plugins to figure out how they work. In this series we're going to pick an open source plugin, we're going to look at the code inside of the editor and figure out how it works all in real time. So for this first video we'll start with a simple plugin, one that was created by us at minimum.studio that doesn't have a lot of code. So let's get started. Okay, so we're starting on the new Bubble plugins page. First of all, shout out to the Bubble team for improving this, it's much better now. So one quick tip that I want to share with you guys is if you scroll down over here and click on this drop down and change it to free only, it's going to show all of the free plugins. Now, in Bubble, if a plugin is free, it is by default open source, and you can always click on any free plugin to see how it works, see the code, check it out in the editor. That's just a quick tip. Okay, so the plugin that we're going to check out today is called Reset All Inputs. It's a very simple plugin that we built at Minimum, and it's basically a plugin that just resets inputs on a page. So everyone that uses Bubble knows that there is an action called reset relevant inputs, which basically does this. It resets relevant inputs. So inputs that have been used in workflows, inputs that have been referenced, it will reset. This works 95% of the time, but there's some cases where this action doesn't work and we need this plugin instead. So a case where it doesn't work, for example, is if you have a input inside of a reusable element and that reusable element is part of a form and you want to reset the whole form when someone clicks on a button, and it will basically reset all the inputs besides the one that's in the reusable element. So to combat that, you can fix it very easily by adding some JavaScript to the page that does this. We just took that JavaScript, made it one simple action that you can put in this plugin. It's a free and open source plugin that anyone can use. So we're going to go and check it out. So how you can go inside of a plugin, you basically just go to the plugin and then there's going to be this link over here that says see plugin code, which you're going to click. This is going to take you to the plugin editor for that specific plugin. And okay, so we're inside of the plugin editor. We're quickly going to go over each tab to see which of these tabs are actually being used for the plugin. And we're going to start with the general tab. So we're looking at the general tab. This is basically the place where you put all of the information that shows up on the listing, right? So if you put the description here and the instructions and the URL for the demo and the categories, that's basically what it uses so that it shows up on the plugin marketplace, right? So nothing interesting here. Then there's the shared tab. In here, it looks empty for this plugin. That's because there's no shared code. But usually we'd put some code here that can be shared between the elements and the actions if they're client-side. And you can also add some keys here, which basically gives a place for users to put in like API keys and stuff inside of the plugin. You've probably used a plugin that asks you to put in an API key. You can define which keys you need for your plugin. So this isn't relevant for this action as well, or for this plugin. So obviously there's also no API calls in this plugin. It's not a plugin that makes API calls, so there's no API calls here. There's also no elements because there's no visual element for this plugin. It's just an action that you can run. So the only place where we'll actually find some plugin content is in the actions tab. So this is already something that you guys should know, that you can have a plugin that only is an action. You don't need to have an element or an API call or anything else. You can just have a plugin that does one of these things. In this case, the plugin is just a simple action. So what's important to know here is that this is a client-side action. There's two types of actions. You have server actions and there's client-side action. So a client-side action is an action that runs on your browser, on the user's device essentially. So Bubble will download this plugin when your page is loaded and this plugin is used, and it will basically just download this code and it will be on the user's machine and it will execute whenever you trigger that action from the editor. Okay, so we can see that the code over here is very simple. All it really does in a nutshell is it looks for all of the inputs on a page. That's what document.querySelector does. And then it loops over them. So let's say there's 5 or 6 or 7 inputs on this given page. When you run this action, it's going to find all of them, and then it's going to loop over each of them just to run this piece of code that's inside of the loop for each element inside of this list, right? So we can see that there's 2 lines of code here, and one is it takes the element and then it sets the value to null, and then it does a blur function. So what does this code do? This is basically the code that makes the input blank, right? So we're removing the value and then we're essentially removing the focus. That's what the blur function does. So these two lines of code are the most important and the most interesting ones, because these 2 lines of code basically tell Bubble that this input has been changed. Because usually when you're typing in an input, Bubble knows that you are changing the value, right? If you ever use something like auto binding, it automatically writes that value to the database as you're typing. Bubble knows that an input is changed when this event is fired, right? So we need to manually tell Bubble after we make a change to the input that it was changed, so that Bubble can pick up on the change and basically react to it. If we don't have these 2 lines of code, it will appear on your page that the inputs are blank, they're empty. But once you're trying to access the value, you will still see the value that it was before. So these two lines are very crucial for this plugin, right? So that's basically what the whole plugin does, right? There's only two things that it's really doing. It's just taking input's value, putting it on blank, and then letting Bubble know that we changed it so that it can react to it. Conditionals work that if you're trying to access an input's value, that it will be updated. So that's basically all this code does. And it runs whenever you trigger the action, right? So this code doesn't run page load. It doesn't run randomly. It just runs whenever you decide to run it. And that's when the inputs get reset. So that's all this code does, right? And if we then continue, we can also see that there's nothing in the settings besides the plugin being pushed. And there's a few people that install the plugin, but there's no reviews. So let's check out the actual demo of this, right? So how does it work? So we can go here and we can basically look for the demo. This is actually one of the problems, I think, with the new plugin page. There's not really a link to the demo. So I happen to know the demo because we built it. So I'm just going to go there directly. So it's going to be reset or reset all inputs.bubble.apps.io. And we can see over here that this is the demo. And we have 4 inputs. And one of these inputs, I think it's the second one, is inside a reusable element just to kind of like trigger the behavior. And we can see here that this is a piece of text that is accessing the value of each input so that we can see whether or not Bubble detects changes, right? So if I interact with the input manually, you can see that this changes. But if I then click reset, you can see that it also still changes because that's what those 2 lines of code do. If we would remove those 2 lines of code, that wouldn't work. It would still say this input is not empty. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need to know about this plugin. This is a very simple plugin. Okay, just to wrap up, let's quickly recap what we learned. So 1, any plugin that's free is by default open source. We can confirm that over here. This is a free plugin and we can see that it's open source, MIT licensed. 2, a plugin doesn't have to have all of these elements. A plugin can be just an action or just an element or just an API call. It doesn't have to have all of these things. And 3, we learned how this code actually functions. And we learned that the magic behind this code is these 2 lines of code, which basically notify Bubble that we made a change to the inputs so that it can pick up on it and update all of the conditionals and the values. Alright, so that's going to be it for the very first installment of the plugin teardown series. Please let me know which of the free plugins you think I should dissect next time so I can check it out. And in general, I'd love to hear your feedback on the format of this series so we can improve it over time. You can leave a comment, you can find me on Twitter. Those are the best ways to get in touch. Thanks for watching.